ask questions when need be. Cool. So that's what we're going to do. And so what we're going to do today is finish out the Spinoza. And by finish the Spinoza, I do not mean in any way, shape, or form get through all of the ethics, but instead get through as far as we can part one of the ethics. As I said, probably won't be specific questions about much past Proposition 14, because I don't think we're going to make it that far ahead. All right, so just to begin class, I wanted to review, just by briefly flashing up, definitions that we had from previously before we talk about the axioms of Spinoza and then go through propositions 1 through 14. Then if we get that far, I'm going to quit going through the propositions and then just try to explain in general what all the rest of the Spinoza is about, because we don't have time to go through every single thing, every argument he makes and so forth. But I want to have some time to talk about the general picture and how it's different from Descartes, for instance. So last time we went through, I called the lecture Substance, Attribute, and Mode in Spinoza, or something like that. So mastering those three ideas, substance, attribute, and mode in Spinoza is half of the journey towards understanding what's going on in Spinoza. So it is important to understand what he thinks about those things and what he means. So by substance, he says, I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. In other words, that of which a conception can be formed independently of any other conception. So I think the important example that we gave last time about this is that if you have, in the normal case of what Descartes would think of a substance, Descartes would say like a table is a substance. And so Descartes would say, well, the table is the substance, and then modes of the substance are things like the color. So it's, I'm going to say brown. I don't know what color this is. It's brown, right? The brownness of the table only kind of exists because the table does. If the table went away, then the brownness of the table will go away. But the table doesn't depend on the brownness. If the brownness went away, say the table became green, the table would still exist, right? So the table is an independent existent. All its properties, its modes, are not independent existences. So substance is the thing that's independently existing. And Spinoza says, in his way of talking about it, he says, is conceived through itself. You can think of the table without thinking of the modes of the table, but you can't think of the modes of the table without thinking of the table. Try to think of the table's brownness without thinking of the table, right? You can think of brown without doing that, but you can't think of the table's brownness. Spinoza ultimately is not going to say that tables are substances. He's going to think that these things are finite modes. They're modes of God, right? But we'll have to get there. He's got this substance idea that's very similar to the substance ideas we've seen in the past. Okay, down. All right. By mode, I mean the modifications of a substance or that which exists in and is conceived through something other than itself. So again, good example to get your ideas around it is the table's brownness exists in the table and is thought of through the table. Again, Spinoza is not going to think that tables are actually substances. That's what Descartes thinks. But that's good for getting the idea. So it's good to start with Descartes and understand what he thinks about substance and mode. Spinoza is going to use the same definitions sort of substance and mode, but he's ultimately going to say rather wild things about those things. Okay, sorry. Oh, and I missed, yeah, so substance, I miss attribute. And then attribute is one of the hardest things to understand in Spinoza. Partly even the scholars, the important philosophers today who still write books about Spinoza have some debates about what he means by attribute. But he says attribute is that which the intellect perceives as as constituting the essence of the substance. The best way to think about it is, again, I think, on analogy with Descartes. You start with Descartes and then you see how Spinoza changes it a bit. So Descartes says there are thinking substances. Thinking substances have certain sorts of modes. They have ideas, they have desires, they have beliefs and whatnot. And then Descartes says there are extended substances. Extended substances have certain other types of modes. Shape, color, size, motion, whatnot. And so thinking, this broad category, is the essence of certain types of things. So Descartes thinks that he is a thinking thing. So his essence is to have thought. And that says something about the types of modes he's allowed to have and the types of modes he must have. And that's what the essence of being a thinking thing is. And similarly, for an extended thing, there's certain modes you must have. You must have a certain length. You must have a certain hardness. So being an extended thing is to need to have certain modes, right? One or another kind of extension or hardness. And also, yeah, so it's an ability to have certain modes as well. Yeah, so you must have one in this category. You can have one in the category, and you do have one in the category. And then the crucial innovation in Spinoza is, as crazy as it sounds, where he says the attribute is the essence of the substance. He says some substances can have multiple attributes. In fact, he will ultimately think that all substances have all the attributes because he thinks there's only one substance, and that substance is God, and God has all the attributes. Cool. So that's substance, attribute, and mode in Spinoza. And then the first part of the ethics is called like on God or of God. I forget how it's translated. Because the whole of the ethics could just be called God or on God or of God, because Spinoza's entire theory is that the only thing that exists is God. There is one substance. That substance is God. And in a way, we'll have to see the way in which that means, but in a way, we're all modes of God, right? So we are way that God is, right? God is nature. He's all of reality. I shouldn't say he, because that's very Christian or whatever. Spinoza doesn't say he, and when he does, it's not capitalized or whatever. So God is a God of nature. God is made out of nature. God is indifferent nature. And then everything that exists that we see aren't independently existing substances, but rather modifications of God. And so that's Spinoza's ultimate view about what God is. But his definition of God, he says, it's a being that's absolutely infinite. It's a substance consisting of infinite attributes. So not just extension and thought, but other things. Does Spinoza tell us what those other things are? No, he doesn't. But at the very least, those two things and any other thing that you can think of, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essentiality. The eternal stuff and the infinite stuff is a little bit less important for our purposes, right? Yeah, so just more stuff for Spinoza. So the view that I have for Spinoza's God is that it's a substance, but it's a substance that has multiple attributes. One attribute might be thought. one attribute extension. Well, not just might be, is thought one attribute is extension, right? Because there's thinking stuff in the world. So God, since God is everything, God has to be the part of the world that's capable of having the thought. There's extended stuff in the world, so God has to be the thing that's capable of being modified in extended ways. And then all the other attributes, but Spinoza doesn't say what they are, so we just have to have a picture where God has infinitely many attributes, but we only know what 2 of them are. And then the attributes are, well, all the thinking that you can imagine, the ideas are going to be modes of God, and all the extended things like tables are going to be modes of God. So ultimately, everything is a mode of God. I'm talking a little bit metaphorically because ultimately the idea will be, it's not the table is the mode of God, it's rather the table is made up of a bunch of smaller parts. The smaller parts are the modes of God, and then they exist, and then the smaller parts existing and being arranged in the way that they are make up the table. So it's not really the table is the mode of God, but all the actual things that are here, right? The thing is made out of particles. Those particles are the modes of God. The table is just a larger thing built out of those things. Cool. Questions so far about substance, attribute, or mode? That's the recap from last time. All right.
The mention about Spinoza is not similar to Descartes on substance, as in he doesn't believe that. So it all comes back to the God is one substance. Is that what you were saying? It's the same definition that they're using, but then they're using a different.
Yeah, I think so. That's important. Yeah, so it's the kind of same definition. So for both Descartes and Spinoza, I keep calling him substance for some reason. For both Descartes and Spinoza, yeah, substance is kind of the thing that independently exists. And so that's the general idea. But then the difference between Descartes and Spinoza is Descartes is going to look at a table and say, table, look, this table independently exists. It has various modifications, but the table could still exist even if the modifications changed. The table is an independent existent. So Descartes uses that conception of substance to say that the table is a substance. But then Spinoza, using the same definition of substance as something that exists in itself and separately, thinks that God is the only thing that exists within itself. And so Spinoza, looking at the same table, is going to say, well, Descartes' right about what a substance is, but he's wrong that a table is a substance, right? So that's going to be the main difference. They have a general thing that's the same, is that they both think of substance as the independent existing thing. But Spinoza is going to think that Descartes thinks that there's too much independent existence. There's actually only one independent existent, that's God. And everything else depends on God. Other questions? All right. So I'm going to go through the axioms that Spinoza presents. I think maybe they're less important than getting into the propositions and seeing the arguments in one or another direction, but we can still look at them. Some of them are very revealing about how Spinoza sees the world, and they don't always redound to his credit, in the sense that some of the way that Spinoza sees the world, we of modern perspective would think is kind of silly and wrong. I think that's a lot of Spinoza. That's true of. Okay. So his first axiom is everything which exists either in itself or in something else. And so the question I have about this is, does this mean the same thing as everything is either a substance or a mode of a substance? I put it as a question rather than a claim that I intend to defend. I think that the answer is roughly yes, right? So everything which exists either exists in itself, so it's an independently existing substance, or it's something that exists in something else, like a mode of a substance. This seems to leave off attributes. So attributes seem to not, if I said everything is a substance or a mode, then you might say, where is an attribute? But I think the way Spinoza is thinking is that attributes are kind of they're the essence of a substance and kind of the building blocks of a substance, so that a substance is kind of made out of its attributes. So there's not a sense in which attributes are things that exist and they're independent of substances and they're separate from them, but rather what is a substance? But a substance is rather a thing that's made out of its attributes. And with the attributes not being kind of separate existences that you can imagine apart, because the attribute is the essence of a substance. So if you, again, on a Cartesian model, it's easy to understand because Descartes, for instance, is a thinking substance. Since he's a thinking substance, that just is an idea about what modes he can have and what modes he can't have, and what modes he must have to be a thinking substance. And those sort of modal qualities are just something about what the nature of the substance itself is, the essence of the substance. So I think Spinoza doesn't have attributes as being like a third thing, but rather just the essence or character of what a substance is. So I think axiom 1 says everything is either a substance or a mode, roughly. Axiom 2 says that which cannot be conceived through anything else must be conceived through itself. This is a little bit important because we already have the idea of modes are defined as things that are conceived through other things. So you might think of this little bar that I've been drawing that connects Descartes, the substance, to his modes, as being the relation of this mode is conceived through this substance. But axiom 2 says something more about the conceived through relation. It says, while all the modes are conceived through the substance that they are attached to, the substance itself is conceived through itself. So it says that which cannot be conceived through anything else, that is the independent existences, the substances, they are not conceived through something else, like a mode, and therefore Spinoza says they're conceived through themselves. And that's going to be important, as we'll see in Spinoza's proof of the existence of God. Right, so that's axiom 2. Substances are conceived through themselves. That may be how I sum that one up. Axioms 3 and 4 relate to Spinoza's kind of weird, and we will talk about it, but kind of weird theory of causation. So I'll just give you the 2 axioms, and then axiom 3 and axiom 4, so the 2 axioms. And then we'll consider a short debate about Spinoza's claims and then what Hume later says. And we'll see why Spinoza is a little bit kind of weird here. So he says, axiom 3 is from a given definite cause, an effect necessarily follows. So causes bring about their effects of necessity. This is a very normal way to think about the world. You know, if I drop something, it's kind of like, then it has to fall. Like it doesn't have a bunch of choices if I drop a thing, right? It kind of only has one choice, which is it must fall, right? So from a given and definite cause, an effect necessarily follows. And on the other hand, if no definite cause can be granted, it's impossible that an effect can follow. So if, you know, you don't, so if you hit the pool ball, then it will go forward and hit another pool ball. But if you don't hit it, it's not just going to on its own start moving, right? So for everything to happen, it must be caused. And for every effect that happens, it happens as a definite and necessary effect of its cause. I don't think that's all that weird about Spinoza. Axiom 3 is fine by me, right? Axiom 4, however, is where Spinoza gets weird. He says the knowledge of an effect depends on and involves the knowledge of a cause. I hope we can all agree that intuitively this is not correct, right? So the sense in which it is intuitively not correct is suppose that, oh no, a bad thing has happened. Michael has cancer. Okay, so we know the effect. So I have knowledge of the effect. Michael has cancer. It was caused by something, probably something bad that he did, like smoking. So we have knowledge of an effect. Do I necessarily know the cause? Does my knowledge of the effect depend on my knowledge of the cause? You would think not normally, right? You get sick later. You're like, why am I sick, right? You're sick to your stomach. Then you have to think about it. Was it the thing I ate for breakfast? Was it the thing I ate last night? Was it not something I ate, but something I drank? Was it something else, right? Am I sick because I got the flu, right? You can know the effect without knowing the cause. That's how we normally think about causes and effects. Axiom 4 seems to lie to us and says that the knowledge and effect depends on the knowledge of the cause. It seems to be wrong, and I think Spinoza means the thing that is wrong. So sometimes it's important to understand Spinoza by just sometimes understanding that he just believed things that we don't believe, right? And I'll try to explain how he's thinking about cause so that he thinks of it in a way that is what I think is wrong, and the kind of criticism that's been met, right? So for Spinoza, each cause has a specific and determinate effect, and knowing the cause allows you to know what the effect must be. So this is known as the rationalist theory of causation, that knowledge of the underlying circumstances, you know what comes next. So I was talking about, if you know the effect, can you infer back the cause? I was pointing out that not in general. And then it's also true that in general, if we know the cause, that is, we know the setup, we don't automatically know the effect, right? We have to do experiments, we have to collect evidence in order to discover if this is the physical setup, the cause, then this is the effect, right? But Spinoza is thinking, well, if you know the setup, then you know what must happen. Like if I know I'm going to drop it, then I know it must fall. And so that's the rationalist theory of causation, where like when you know the setup, then you sort of know what happens next. And you can see how people could get started on the idea and think like Spinoza, because you see that there's a kind of necessary connection. If I drop the thing, it has no choice but to fall, right? So it's like necessarily connected. Dropping is like necessarily involved with its falling. So if there's this, how could that necessary connection exist? Well, Spinoza is thinking about it as a kind of logical connection. If I know the setup, there's only one logical follow through with the setup. I think we don't think that, and I'll give examples of why. So here's a way to think about causation that might suggest this Spinozist picture. So Spinoza gives this example himself. He says, think about why, so we're asking for, in some sense, the causes. So why is this angle B and this angle C identical, right? Well, because it's an isosceles triangle. So if you notice these little tick marks, it's because these two sides are the same length. If these two sides are the same length, then these two angles must be the same length. So the reason why the angles are the same length is because the sides are the same length. That is because it's an isosceles triangle. And so here's a way of saying, why is this so? It's because this setup, and so this this sort of mathematical understanding of why is this so, because the setup, is how Spinoza is also thinking about what we would call, or what Aristotle would call efficient causes, right? When you drop something and it falls, you kick something and it moves, those sorts of things. Spinoza is thinking that the setup, so why did the result happen? Because this was the setup, and there's this sort of logical connection between the setup and the result. So if you set up the triangle such that this side is the same as this side, then it must be the case that this angle is the same as this angle. And so if you set it up that, like, I kick the chair, then it must be the case that the chair moves in that direction and spins around as it just does, right? So that's the notion. So that's how Spinoza is thinking about cause in axiom 4. But this rationalist conception of causation is not popular. And so here is Hume kind of explaining. This may seem so obvious to us in retrospect, but we have to realize that these are old-timey thinkers. Sometimes they get things wrong just because nobody has come up with why that's a wrong way to think about things. So David Hume has a very good explanation. David Hume, we'll be reading him later, but he's an empiricist. Spinoza is a rationalist. Rationalists kind of think that most of our knowledge, or a substantial chunk of our knowledge, doesn't come from experience, but comes from thinking about things. So Spinoza is thinking, if you think about the setup, you know what conclusion must follow. And Hume wants to argue that actually, if you think about the setup, nothing follows about what happens afterwards. Only experience tells us, if you set up the physical experiment this way, this will be the outcome. So Hume says the contrary of every matter of fact, like I dropped the thing and it fell, is still possible. So the contrary would be, I dropped the thing and then it didn't fall, it just floated here, or it like flew up, or whatever. The contrary of every matter of fact is still possible, right? Because it doesn't imply a contradiction. There's no contradiction in thinking that I dropped the thing and it doesn't fall, but rather it hovers or flies up or goes to the side. No contradiction. So it's different from the triangle case, where there is a contradiction in thinking this side and this side are equal, but this angle and this angle are not equal. You can prove a contradiction. But there's no contradiction between thinking I drop a thing and then it doesn't fall. So Hume says there's no contradiction. It's no logical requirement that the physical setup is one way, and therefore the effect must be another way. All reasonings about matters of fact, Hume says, seem to be based on the relation of cause and effect. Blah, blah, blah. If you know that A causes B, and if you see A happen, then you can infer B will happen. And if you see B, okay, yeah, that's about how, I want the example. So here's an example. Water causes drowning, right? How do we know this? It's not as a matter of logical necessity, right? It's not because I know that if somebody goes in the water and goes under the water for 10 minutes that they will definitely die. That's not a logical truth. It's rather from experience. In the past, when people went into the water and stayed under the water for a sufficient amount of time, they never came back. And that's why I know that water causes drowning. It is not because it's a logical relation. And Hume makes the point as follows. Causes and effects are discoverable not by reason, but by experience. Adam, who's this mythical character in the Christian Bible, who is the first human being on earth. Adam, the first human being on earth, he doesn't have anybody else to learn from, could not have inferred from the fluidity and transparency of water. That is, he can't just look over there and see the water that he's never touched yet and infer that it must be able to drown him, right? That's something he has to learn from experience. Whereas Spinoza's idea is, if you know the cause and you know the setup, then the effect must follow. So for Spinoza has to say, when you look at the water, you kind of know that it must drown you if you go in there and go under it. But Hume is saying that's not true, right? You can't look at water and know what it must do to you. You have to have experience and find out what it does do to you. And then similarly from, you can't just look at a fire and know that if you get near it, it will burn you. You have to have that experience. So I think Spinoza does have this rationalist theory of causation. This is one of the reasons why it's hard to read these old-timey people and understand what they mean, because you read it and you immediately want to say, well, he can't possibly mean that. That's a crazy thing to believe, right? That I know the effects from knowing their causes as a logical conclusion, but it's not crazy if you're an old-timey person, right? If you realize, I think Spinoza does realize that a correct thing, which is there seems to be some sort of necessary connection between dropping something and it falling. Like if I drop a thing, it's kind of like it has to fall. And so Spinoza has one model for necessary connection, which is the logic model. In logic, if you have a certain setup, you have these premises, there are some conclusions that necessarily follow. And so Spinoza says there's a necessary connection between things falling, dropping things and then falling. And so the only model he really has is this logical connection, and that's how he tries to understand causation. It leads Spinoza into some kind of strange beliefs. And so that's why I think it's important to interpret Spinoza as having the kind of strange belief about causation, because that's what explains his other strange beliefs, right? You wouldn't understand his other strange beliefs unless you were willing to attribute him the thing that he says. He says, you know, knowledge of a effect depends on knowledge of the cause, right? Okay, let's finish the axioms and then we can have a break. This is also an important axiom. Things which have nothing in common cannot be understood the one by means of the other. The conception of one does not involve the conception of the other. So it's not clear what Spinoza is ruling out. He says things that have nothing in common cannot be understood by means of one another or conceived through one another. Before we saw the conceived through relation obtains between a mode and a substance that has that mode. The mode is conceived through the substance. We also saw in axiom 1 that substances are conceived through themselves. So that's also how conceived through works. And now the question is, could I have two things, say two substances, and one substance is conceived through another one? Well, obviously not, because substances are conceived through themselves. Could I have, anyway, but the general idea is a further prohibition on how conceived through works. And conceived through does not, if two things are unrelated to one another in any way, shape, or form, one cannot be conceived through another. This winds up being a pretty important principle for Spinoza, but largely because he argues that there aren't any, like we'll see in proposition 5, he says there can't be two thinking substances, for instance. So if there can't be two thinking substances, then any two substances won't be alike in that they're thinking, and therefore one can't be conceived through the other. Cool. Axiom 6 is Spinoza's correspondence theory of truth. He says a true idea must correspond with its ideate or object. I don't want to explain this too much because I think we will have almost zero chance of getting to where it matters. But if we do get there, I'll go back and explain it. So here I had some quotes from Aristotle and his correspondence theory of truth, but I don't want to explain Aristotle either unless we need to. So let's try to move on and get there. And then the final axiom that Spinoza has is if a thing can be conceived as non-existing, its essence does not involve existence. So if you can just close your eyes and think, oh, I can imagine a world, wouldn't it be nice if Michael didn't exist? Then I wouldn't have to sit through this dumb lecture, right? You can close your eyes and imagine that Michael doesn't exist. If you can succeed at doing that, then it follows that the essence of Michael doesn't involve Michael's existence, right? So if you can think of a thing not existing, then its essence doesn't involve existence. Seems pretty straightforward. Yeah, so sometimes Spinoza says things that seem crazy. Sometimes it's things that sounds straightforward, but then Spinoza uses them to prove something crazy or to attempt to prove something crazy. Anyways, so some of those axioms will only make more sense when we get to the propositions. So that's the main thing that I'd like to do today is get through Spinoza's proof of God's existence. But because it is 9:30 now,